Before I introduce my panel, I'm going to ask you to do something. I want you to talk to the person who's next to you for about a minute and a half. And the thing that I want you to talk about is what hasn't been said that you think is important. And number two, what do you think we ought to do about it? Because our conversation needs to move from what's the problem to what is it that we need to do about it. So I want you to think about those two things. What hasn't been said that you think that would be important to help us understand the conversation even more? And then secondly, what do you do about it? Would you talk to the person who's next to you just for a moment? And if you don't know that person, introduce yourself to that person. Okay, everyone? All right. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you in a moment about what you talked about, but first I'd like to introduce our panel. And as I've mentioned to you, all of their bios are in the program, so you'll have a sense of who this very distinguished group of people are. At the far end is Andrea Cabral, who is the former Secretary of Public Safety for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and Secretary Cabral was also one of our former sheriffs. Next to her is Reverend Jeffrey Brown, who is the founder of Rebuilding Every Community Around Peace, RECAP. Next to Reverend Brown is Denise McWilliams, who is the executive director of the New England Innocence Project. Next is Roy Martin, who works for the Department of Public Health here in Boston and is the director of Partnership Advancing Community Together, or PACT. And next is the Honorable Leslie Harris. Judge Harris is a retired associate justice with the Juvenile Court of Suffolk County. Now, I could tell you lots of things about these people, but the thing that I'd probably like for you to know is, as I counted up, we've got about 100 years of experience. Now, I'm not going to suggest who's that old, but there's a lot of experience up here on the dais. We have on the dais someone who's an attorney, a judge, a minister. We have a program administrator. We have a former sheriff. We have an advocate. We have a policymaker. We have an innovator. And we have at least one provocateur. Which one? So I want to welcome them, and please join me in welcoming our panel. So let me just ask just an easy question to a panelist first. So you've heard a lot of things today, and I'm wondering your general reactions to the kinds of things that we've heard. And as we've done in previous times, this is a conversation among panelists, among ourselves, and then we'll engage our audience as well. General reactions?
My first reaction is that they did not talk about juveniles enough. You know, I've been a juvenile court judge, been a former school teacher and stuff like that. We are criminalizing children in my community at too young an age. For things that I did as a child, when my mama had to come up to school, they now call the police, you know, and it's not right. And we didn't really talk about that part and the impact of being arrested and what it does to a child forever. You redefine who that child is, both criminally, but as far as their own self-esteem is concerned. And it bothers me a lot.
Okay. Other reactions?
I thought that everything, pretty much, that was said from the stage, whether it was by a panelist or from the podium, was true. All of those things are true about the system. And, as opposed to an or, there are a number of things going on in different states, sometimes just narrowed down to different cities and towns, that are remarkably progressive and positive, and are moving the country slowly in the direction that we need to be. But I couldn't take issue with any of the things that were said. I do think it's important, especially since this young lady raised the point about disbanding the police department. It's just important to keep in mind that when you talk about bad behavior that occurs in any profession, but particularly in law enforcement, where the decisions that are made have such a huge impact on people's lives, it's just important to remember that that doesn't necessarily represent all police officers. And that when you find something bad or rotten within a particular department, even if it is deeply, deeply institutionalized, that's not a reason for getting rid of the good purpose for which that department was created. It is your job, as Dr. Bassett, said, to eradicate that bad part. But you know, if you're being attacked on the street and a social worker walks by, and a police officer walks by, you're going to call for the cop. So you can't replace one for the other, but you work to change the things about the way law enforcement operates or the way the criminal justice system operates currently that you don't like, that you think are unfair. And I think that we are, for the first time in a very, very long time, moving toward that.
I think that I want to respond to the gentleman who was speaking as I came in late, unfortunately, about being the choir. I agree that everything that was said here this morning was insightful, intelligent, more accurate than I think we can actually expect given the limited resources people deal with. But the problem is we all pretty much agree with each other. We all pretty much think this way. And I think our real challenge is how do we take these messages and communicate them to people who don't think like we do in a way that they can hear what we're saying and begin to move towards a better place in addressing these issues. I don't have an answer to that.
Oh, yeah, because I'm going to come back and ask you what we would do, so you set yourself up.
Okay.
Reverend Brown.
Yeah. First of all, it's a very dangerous thing to give the Baptist minister a microphone. Takes me about 15 minutes just to clear my throat, But I thought everything was great. Glenn and I go back years and years, and he and his associate I thought were just fantastic. It was absolutely stunning. The way that they were able to simply lay out the story in all of its honesty and sort of got to the heart of the matter. I mean, we're all about data and trying to make sure we get all the evidence right. But when you have the embodiment of those stories, they're just as moving, as the data. I think, though, we're in a real paradox in communities of color. And that is, we've had, on the one hand, a historical distrust of law enforcement. And it's been built up over, if you think about decades of failed housing policies, poor educational institutions, chronic unemployment and underemployment, poor health care, and then you throw in guns, and you throw in drugs, and then the response from the state is more law enforcement, more cops, and more strategies. There's always this historical distrust. But then, I was thinking about what Andrew was saying. If I'm in my house 11:30 at night and I hear something going on the first floor, I'm not going to call EDO. I'm going to call 911, and I'm going to expect somebody to come in, and whoever's breaking in my house, I want them to get it. And so the paradox is, how do we move forward, in terms of public safety, in communities of color? How do you begin to build the trust that needs to be there? And how long is it going to take when we're in a nation that is increasingly getting darker and darker?
But Roy, I see you wanting to say something, but I have a question for you with your cards. Do you trust the police? Interesting. Great. Thank you. Red means no. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, you want the scale? Yeah. Red. Yeah. I think that's 2 cards. Okay. Thank you very much, Roy.
Actually, you just changed what I was about to say with that. And now I want to answer it. I do trust the police. I do trust the police. I trust the police to be the police. I trust a cat to be a cat. I trust a fish to be a fish. I trust the police to be the police. I think this is part of the problem. So as it relates to what we heard in this conversation, I feel like what we heard was the scope of the problem. And then we started hearing from the audience sort of what's actionable. What do we do? Like, I think I heard that from our sisters over here. We heard that on this side a bit as well. And I think we all need to keep in mind chronology. Like, how long has, racism been an issue? 2,000 years? I hope we don't think we're going to fix this by this weekend. So I think we need to be clear, like, we got a long road. We got a lot of, struggling and a lot of working to do. And it may be something that you can only take, put it this way, we may need to think first down, not touchdown. All right? And so I'm like, all right, so we need to move the chains a certain, distance, and then someone else come behind that. Like, and then, we need to have an individual approach to it, your family, your community, and then a policy level approach. So in terms of what's actionable, there is no one person in this room that is powerless to do anything about racism. You can do something as an individual about racism, just with your choices. And then what you can do is you can identify other people that are like you, and you can join with those people. You can find another family that kind of is addressing the issue like you. Like, for example, like, say if there's a particular store in the neighborhood that you feel like is treating your people terrible from the community. Well, as a community, you can decide, I'm not going in there. You know, I don't know why you're going in there. I'm gonna explain the scope of the problem to you, and then I'm gonna question you. If we're brothers, if we're part of the same community, why are you going in this store? And so there's a bunch of things that we could just do without even getting into policy. And part of it is like we talk about, you know, law enforcement. You know, I mean, there's a certain amount of actions that we can take, whether we like it or not, that don't speak to equality. Because I think that's where people get stuck. Everyone wants to be equal. And I'm like, that's really a silly kind of ambition. So when you're engaged with law enforcement, your ambition really is, I just want to get out of here. You know? And so I don't want to argue that I should be able to do, like when we see, you know, you might have a white colleague in his interaction with police, he can yell at him. I'm not fighting for the right to yell at him just like he's yelling at him. And so that's not my ambition. I'm like, look, so if that is what I'm fighting for, the right to do the same thing like other people are doing, I think you're off base. You know, so we should be fighting for very specific things. We need to keep in mind there's a conversation about tactics that we all may approach differently. Like one person may have this, you know, set of tactic, another might have a different set. We don't need to argue tactic. But if we're all working on particular issues that will meet at the same place, then that's fine. And so we need to start getting into discussions about what we can do as individuals, what's actionable, because as we talked about last night, the data is like boogeyman data. You know, you look at the data, it's like, I'm gonna die before everybody. Like, right, like, you know, when you think about it, like, that's what the data says, right? I'm dying first, right? So I'm like, that's not my ambition to be like, well, why can't I live as long as the dude from Greece eating the Mediterranean diet? I'm like, look, I just need to move, you know, I just need to move my life expectancy from what it is now, generationally, just upwards, and not care about somebody else's mark. Create my own mark and move towards that. So we shouldn't be fighting to do some of the things and be equality. I want to equally be able to do it. Nah, pick your own lane like a marathon runner or like a dude running a mile. You know, it's your own time you're competing against. That's what you're doing. You're not competing against anybody else. So we need to figure that out first as individuals because we don't all have the same appetite. You know, some of us, that is our ambition. I want to be just like racists. I want to be able to do the same things they do. Some of us, that's not what we want to do. So figure out who your crowd is, you know, and it should start in your household and then in your community. Find another family that's like you. That way, when there's a Flint water crisis, you know a family you could call. And you're not as reliant on the government, the people you want to call racist, the people who for 2,000 years plus, you've seen the same thing, but you think in year 2001, something different is going to happen. I'm like, you know what? The one thing I can take action on is me and Judge Harris. I know where he lives. He know where I live. If there's a water crisis, I'm calling Judge Harris. I'm calling Brother Jeff. I'm calling Sister Andrea. And if I know there's somebody that's like, we don't believe in the same thing, I don't care if he live right next to me. I'm not calling that dude.
Les, I saw you reacting to a few things that Roy had to say. What's on your mind?
Well, you know, I come from a strange, mixed-up background in the sense that I grew up in the projects in Chicago, the Ida B. Wells and the Darrell homes. My father was a military cop. My older brother was a Chicago policeman and sergeant for 32 years and became a police chief up in Michigan. But if the police came in our neighborhood, we ran, whether we were doing anything or not, because we did not have positive interactions with the police. I got stabbed a couple of times, shot at, never would have thought about calling the police. Never entered my mind, was never a consideration for me to think about the police coming, because even though I might have been a victim, I would have been, in my mind, victimized again. You know, but on the other hand, some of my best friends are police officers. You know, and so I've learned to take police individually. I wait, because I have been stopped. You know, they don't know what a wonderful young man I am. And I wait until I see how they're going to act. You know, but one of the things I've told my sons And I raised both my boys, I had my nephew and my younger brother who lived with me. I said, I'm the fighter. You're the survivor. You survive this interaction with the police and leave it to me to deal with them, because that's my job, you know, and I will deal with it. I do not want my kids to be on the 6 o'clock news or whatever as a victim. And I watch, you know, we talk about this now as if this is new. But see, where I grew up, this existed all the time. You got killed by the police, nobody raised a stink because there was nothing you could do about it. The only thing different are those phones you got on your hips, you know, that people are documenting it now and putting it out front and showing what it is. But it has existed in my community where I grew up forever, you know, and the only reason it doesn't exist there now is my community's been wiped out. It's been gentrified out. And so, no, it's not there now. But you go to Chicago, to those places where Chirac was filmed and all, it's still there. And those folks do not think about calling the police because the police don't treat them with any respect. Individuals, I have to say that because I watched my brother give a woman a ticket and she said thank you because he's so polite, you know. Not my experience, but, you know, it's the reality of being black in America.
Sheriff.
So I think there are many parts to this, but perhaps two major parts. There's sort of the policy part, which if you can move the criminal justice system into being both more evidence-based and more trauma-informed, right? We actually, the criminal justice system, even in trials sometimes, operates on an almost anecdotal basis. It certainly operates on an anecdotal basis when it comes to trying to figure out what works to decrease recidivism or to keep people from reoffending. Up till this point, it has been, well, we think this works. If you create a system, or you force the system to utilize actual measures that have been, or programs where the outcomes have been measured, and they are proven to work, and you make sure that those evidence-based programs are part of the criminal justice system and that you're making evidence-based decisions about bail, that your risk assessment on bail is evidence-based. Now, we have a very strong presumption of personal recognizance. People are supposed to be, they're presumed to be allowed after an arrest, except perhaps for murder or very, very serious crime, to be at liberty. If you base all of your decisions about whether or not to take a person's liberty on what the evidence tells you is the risk that they will reoffend or they won't show up to court, and you apply that across the board, then it has the practical effect of decreasing some racial disparity. So there are lots of policy things that you can do. Making a system more trauma-informed. I say this all the time, crime is a symptom. 9 times out of 10, there's certainly a percentage of people who commit crimes seemingly inexplicably, or they're just such horrible crimes that you reach a point where you don't even care about the reason anymore. But the vast majority of people, crime is a symptom. And up until recently, including in our court system, because we now have specialty courts that actually look at the reason behind people, the reasons why people commit crimes. If you look at why people commit crimes, that's a great leveler of the playing field. Because then you can't say that they're doing it because they're black or because they're Latino or because they're gay or because they're this or they're that. The reasons people commit crimes happen across the board. The issue is whether, and people commit crimes based on those reasons across the board. But who goes to jail depends on who gets arrested, and who gets arrested depends on who's available to watch them and arrest them. So all of those little human factors, that's really what determines who goes to jail, not crime, not the evidence of crime. People associate a crime rate, and then you look at how many people of color go to jail, and you think that's because that many people of color are committing a crime. That's not true. So there are lots of policy things that you can do to make your system more evidence-based, more trauma-informed, and give a greater understanding to practitioners as to who they're dealing with, why they're dealing with them, and how they can deal with them in such a way that they maybe need never have to deal with them again. The other part of this that I think is really important, and this is the part, it was raised by an audience member, And it's true that we don't like to talk about our past. And so when you talk about officers that are quicker to shoot, depending on who it is that they stop, that conversation needs to be had. Of all of and there have been many of them, incidences of police shooting, one of the ones that fascinated me the most was the one where man gets pulled over, and he ends up pulling him over, I believe, in a gas station parking lot. And he tells the man to get out of the car, and he does. Then he tells him to get his license. Well, his license and registration are in the console. So he turns his back to the police officer to get his license and registration. The police officer realizes that he has made a grave error because you never, no matter who it is, tell a suspect to turn their back on you and go into an enclosed place where they could pull out God knows what. So he's made a huge mistake. He shoots him. He shoots at him 6 times. I think he hits him twice. And the man actually says, "What did you shoot me for? I was getting my license and I was doing what you asked me to do." And what that drills down to, beyond whether or not he was following his training, whether or not he made a mistake, and whether or not he panicked, what it really drills down to is, what made you think that he would emerge from the side of his vehicle with a gun, where I'm fairly certain that if he were, an Asian man or a white man or a woman even, similarly situated, you would not have shot immediately. You would have had a moment of doubt. That's a hard conversation to have because you're really asking people to identify their bias and to identify for you what it is about what they believe that makes one group of people within the whole group they're supposed to serve and protect more suspicious, more of a threat. And having people confront that, I think, is very difficult. But I also think it goes back to slavery, Reconstruction, and lynching, and the notion that, and people have no idea how, really you should, if you don't know, you should read about the thousands and thousands of people who were lynched over a decades period of time, and it wasn't just in the South. There was strange fruit in the poplar trees in Mississippi, but there were just as many on light posts in Tarrytown, New York, and in northern states. Maybe not just as many, but way too many. The notion that a black life is worth less is deeply ingrained in this country. And when you start asking about that prejudice, why you think that person is going to pose more of a threat to you, why you suspect them immediately of committing a crime, you can trace it back to the notion that it is easier and more acceptable to take a black life than the life of any other.
Certainly the things that you were raising around bias were some of the things that we talked about last night, of who you are, what your experience is, will impact to the experience of how you think about things and how others perceive and receive you as well. Denise?
This is a somewhat complicated and probably chancy thing to say, but I know in a lot of the work I do now, what we do is look for the errors that have occurred in the system. And I think virtually everybody who looks at errors in a system looks to the aviation industry, because the aviation industry has done a tremendous job, a better job than any other industry, at figuring out why these things happen and how to correct them. I believe the medical community now is beginning to get there. The legal community is so far behind, we're not even within hollering distance of this conversation. But what we have to do is to have those conversations that Andrea is talking about in a way that people can feel that they're not going to lose their jobs, there's not going to be blame, and there's not going to be lawsuits. I've been a civil rights attorney for my entire career, and it hurts me to say, don't sue these people. Honestly, suing these people has not solved the problem. It has brought some relief to the hurt individual, which is not to be scoffed at. But the problem, if anything, has gotten worse over the years. And I really think we need to take a step back and to create the structures where we can have the conversation where the police review board can actually have the conversation with, tell us what was going on because we don't want this to happen again. We don't have that sort of a system right now. We have an adversarial system, which quite honestly isn't all that great at getting to the truth or getting to a solution.
Judge, I saw, Roy, I want to come to you just a second. Judge, I saw you responding to Denise's comment about the role of suing individuals and whether or not that's the right kind of process to have.
Police are not afraid to fight with you on the street because that's what they're trained for. And that's why I told my sons that's not what they was. My boys are big. The small one is 6'2". I got a 6'5". My nephew was 6'10". Living in my house and having to walk the streets of Roxbury.
I hope you have high ceilings.
And I don't want them fighting. My part of my explanation to them is that these police officers will pay for your college education if they mess with you in the wrong way, because I will sue them, because that's the only thing they're afraid of. You know, now, sue them individually as well as suing the city, because nothing has changed over these hundreds of years in this city or in this country without people suing, right, Rashawn? Because, you know, you just did a lawsuit. You know, that's the only way we get things changed. If we don't sue the city for getting more black police officers or getting rid of black police officers for a drug test that is biased against black police officers, if we don't, there are no black firemen anymore. I mean, there are no black teachers anymore. They're all disappearing. And that was the only reason they existed was because of a lawsuit. So we don't do class action, I think, more than individual lawsuits. We don't get any place.
So let me just come back to the point you were just making, Denise. So the judge has challenged a little bit of what you've just said around the idea of what's the role of suing. How would you respond to him?
I disagree. Again, I don't think, if people have been suing consistently throughout, I would guess since the 1960s, and we're today at a situation where, as you're saying, more black kids are getting killed by cops. We don't have the...
No, that's not true. They're also still being killed by cops, but I can't say that they're more, because where I grew up, they were getting killed
Yeah, no,
anyway.
that's true. That's true. That's a fair point. Okay, so we haven't seen a decrease we don't think we've seen a decrease in the number of black kids getting killed by cops. We have seen a decrease. There was a period of time, I would guess in the late 60s, early 70s, when you started to see more professions being opened up to folks in the black community. You're not seeing that anymore as well. You just said the teacher population has gone down. I think the lawsuits are good for a lot of reasons. I no longer believe they're good for systematic change, because I think they come and they go. And if you look at the situations we have today, I think that establishes my point.
And Roy sits in the middle and says, I'm just going to sit between the two of them and see where this goes. There's always this thing around the kind of approach that we take, and whether it's an incremental approach, whether it's an adversarial approach, there are a variety of different kinds of things. But Roy, you were trying to make a point a little bit earlier. Did you lose it, or is it now, did it switch and you want to talk about what they're talking about?
I'm like the baloney right now.
Okay, all right.
You know? So I'm like, but I mean, I appreciate both positions, and as an adult, I would listen to both sets of advice, but I would lean towards Judge Harris's advice, more so because, again, even in my first comments, I believe you have to find your own community. So Judge Harris is my elder, you know, Reverend Brown, you know, Sister Andrea, those are my elders. So some of us need to learn. And it's funny, Thea James is right here, right? And I say this about Thea all the time. Like, she could tell me what to do better than she could ask me. You know, so some of us, if you don't trust the knowledge base in your own community, then you shouldn't be in that community. And so if some of our elders are like, no, I know you got advice here, I know you got advice there, we're all told, get a second, third opinion, I'm gonna defer to the advice of my elders. And if they're saying sue, you know, and I understand you're like, suing hasn't gotten us anywhere, voting hasn't gotten us anywhere, marching, where's that gotten us? So we could talk about a bunch of things, and if the metric is where has it gotten us, I'm like, well, we can't be that worse off by following the advice of the elders.
So the important piece here is that there are multiple strategies.
The important
and those
piece-
strategies,
no,
some have what?
no,
No, they're not multiple strategies.
There could be, but
there
I
could
think
be.
the important piece is for an individual to find one strategy, one community. If your one community is splintered all over the place, you're calling it a community, but it's not. You know, so I'm like, if you agree to say, you know what, this is my set of elders, then you got to go by what they say. You got to go by like the culture that they present for you. So there is no all over the place. You just have one.
So you acknowledge that you want to listen to others and take the best judgment of what those people present to you, of the range of strategies that are available. Does that?
I would suggest that as I wouldn't even, you bust me one time, and I claimed young. You were like, you ain't young no more, so I'm like, I ain't gonna claim
Well, it's true,
young.
buddy, you're not.
Right. So I'm like, I ain't gonna pull young. I ain't
Remember
gonna pull
counted
young.
that 100, that 100
Exactly.
number? You're part of that number
Right.
now.
So what I'm saying is, but I think that as emerging adults, whether
Yeah.
we're young people or emerging adults, if you don't have elders, you're in a bad space.
Sure.
Like in the issue, I think the conversation is really for folks who are impacted negatively by this experience. If your experience is positive, or you have no negative, maybe not positive, but no negative, right? Then this conversation is not for you.
Sure.
We're talking about the people who are getting beat up with this experience, and what tactic are you gonna employ as a person that has the negative experience? If things are going well, why change? Why, fix something that ain't broken? So, but if it's broken for us, we gotta make some choices about what we do, and what I would suggest is we don't know everything. And if every time like this happens, and I do come from one of them families, I come from a very tough family, all of that, I got a bunch of generational stuff or whatever, but if we have to begin at scratch with every birth, we're in trouble. If we are not building on the foundation of some elders, and I count even my mentors, strangers who I met in my life, they are now my elders. I'm building on the foundations that they have or they set before me. But in the absence of that, every single one of us is a baby with no history, all right, coming out of the gate. And again, we start fighting racism. You're not even aware. You know how long this been going on? So I'm like, you're right now a lion or a sheep saying, well, the wolf this time is going to be nice. Where historically there's never been a time where a wolf is nice to the sheep. And so I'm like, if the conversation is, well, let's just try, and someone say, listen, man, let's just, let's go way over here and stay away from them, or let's just, like zebras, have our numbers so big that the stripes confuse them. I'm like, you got to figure out what to do based off your own community, how to just survive.
Thank you, Roy. Jeffrey.
Hold on one second.
Yeah, that's
The zebra thing got me, all right?
right, the zebra.
Everybody have their cards. How many of you think that Roy is younger than I just want, no. I'm calling me the elder, I feel like an old man. I'm taking in everything what everyone is saying. I think what I wanted to say was that oftentimes we're looking at either or in terms of solutions. It really is a both and. It really is an array. Instead of like a one-front war, it should be a two-front war. So the protesting that's been happening with Black Lives Matter group here in Boston, we have Black Lives Matter, we Are the Ones, we have a couple of other groups of people who have sparked the protests. I think we would not be having the conversation with the depth that we had if it wasn't for the protesting that's been happening. I was in Ferguson, after Mike Brown's death, and there were tens of thousands of us who just came because they called, and we were there talking about the injustices. But you also have to balance that with the policy prescriptions, right? In Boston, we have a group of young people, Boston Police Camera Action Team, and their one aim is to bring body cameras, to the police department. And they wrote a policy, which they brought to the Boston City Council. And it really sparked a lot of movement. First the mayor and the police commissioner objected to it, and then once they looked deeper into it, or maybe in some cases seeing the reaction from the community, they decided that they'll start to explore it and at least build a pilot for it. So you have to have the protesting on the one hand, because the frustration is there. Martin Luther King used to say, riots are the voices of the unheard. Mm-hmm. And so, you have to get that out. But you have to balance it with the policy prescriptions. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that whatever collaborative work that occurs, to move things forward, it has to have a strong community component. that Burundian quote is so correct, that you do for me without me, you do to me. And so if you don't have the community intimately involved in terms of the solution, for the particular issues that you're dealing with, then it'll never move the dime. And so that means they have to be real and legitimate partners at the table, in order to not only affect policy, but also, affect the practical solutions.
Andrew.
In defense of Denise's position, one of the things that does work, because we've seen it work with corrections officers, if you are trying to, so corrections officers do corrections. They happen to, because our prison systems are de facto psychiatric institutions, be dealing with a high percentage of mentally ill people. When I was sheriff, across the board, the 13 sheriffs that have lockups, we all felt that it was approximately 42% of our population presented with some sort of mental illness, 26% presented with a major mental illness requiring psychotropic medication, and that women presented a 36% higher incidence of mental illness than men, which I contend is because men drive you absolutely insane. But notwithstanding the various causes of it, so if you have corrections officers who believe in security and they're dealing with someone who's mentally ill, ordering them to follow policy isn't going to get through. But you've not equipped them with the tools to deal with someone who's operating on a different level of understanding and is going to continue to do the same things that get them in trouble. So SAMHSA, which is the National Substance Abuse and Mental Health, one of the national substance abuse and mental health policy organizations in the country, has a training where it's a correction officer focused training that teaches them about trauma, teaches them how to identify trauma, but is focused on the trauma that they experience just working in prisons and jails. And what you see is that they begin to understand on a very basic level now who it is they're really dealing with. And the most important thing is they begin to recognize the trauma and the mental illness in themselves and in their own relatives. So they sit in this training, which ostensibly is for work, and they say, oh, that's why my aunt does that, or that's why I do that. Understanding on that level breeds empathy. Now, racism is slightly different in that regard, but if you can have a conversation with someone who does not fear retribution, I mean, we did transgender training in the sheriff's office and said to people, you can ask, it was a former firefighter that came in, and she said, tell them to ask me everything and make sure they understand that none of them will get in trouble because they need to ask me honestly, and I need to look them in the eye and answer them honestly, and then they'll understand. Well, the same thing is true when you ask people to drill down about why they're prejudiced and why they're racist. And most people will agree that they have some kind of bias in them. And when you present it to them, and then you present to them the way their behavior affects people in an arena that is not heightened with tension or fraught with the threat of a lawsuit or any of those other things, people begin to understand themselves better. It doesn't mean that they will change overnight, but it makes them think, and not just in that moment. They think for a long time thereafter. So I actually agree, it's an and. I don't think you should stop suing people, because people deserve to be sued. But I do think it's an and. If you want to know why, you have to ask the question, and you have to be ready for the answer. And you can't avoid that in an adversarial trial court system.
So what you've heard are a number of perspectives around how we begin to address this issue. And I'm wondering what you're thinking. You had an opportunity to talk to each other a moment ago, and I'm wondering the answers to the two questions that you were asked. One is, what's missing from the conversation? But then also, equally important, what do we do about it? Who's first?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. I think one of the things that we haven't really spoke about enough, so we've talked about rates of mental illness within prison populations, but I don't think we've explicitly discussed how policing policies, as well as kind of mass incarceration itself, may play a role as a cause of mental illness. And I think, especially when we talk about adolescent populations in the school-to-prison pipeline, which I think is something that Judge Harris was alluding to earlier, I think we need to do a better job of explicitly saying that these type of policies may actually cause these higher rates. I don't know how to address that yet.
Yeah, it's a complicated one of what causes mental health problems. Do people do their problems become exacerbated by being in the prison system or their involvement with the criminal justice system? I don't know if you have a perspective on this idea, Judge.
I think, I think trauma and being arrested and going into the prison system or just being arrested is a traumatic event in your life. There's a film that one of my former students, my nephew, Boston police officer William Willis, did called Shot in the Hood. And it's on, what's that thing called? YouTube, thank you.
Yeah, right.
You can watch it on YouTube at this point. It's broken down to sections, but it's worth watching. It's worth seeing what it's like for young people to get up in the morning and look out their house left and right before they leave their house, be afraid to go to school, to be afraid to be in school, to be afraid to come home from school. It's interesting to sit in a court and have kids come in from Ashmont Station and saying this white police officer, they've been arrested. Well, she called me a nigger and I got mad. You know, the first time you say, okay, let your mother file a complaint. The second time you say, oh, 2 people have said this. But by the time you get to the 6th child who says this, you know there's a problem that these children are being targeted for just being on their way home. Trauma, I found out I'm a trauma survivor, so I like to talk a lot about trauma now because I know how it's impacted my decisions in life, how I react. And I say, and I keep saying to our court clinic in the courts, that we should have a diagnosis of urban stress. The pressures of surviving in an urban area on a day-to-day basis affects your learning abilities. It affects your reaction to authority figures. We did training with the school police, and we talked about who some of these children are who've been abused, and then you come at them in the same way that their abuser comes at them. So when they do this and knock your hand away and all, and now we got an assault and battery on a police officer, you think that you're doing them a favor by snatching them up. When you've changed their life forever, if you approach them in a different way, the way a trauma victim should be approached, then you have a wholly different outcome. And so I believe that mental health is such an important part of how we deal with people overall, but especially those folks who've entered into our criminal justice system. It is not a user-friendly system.
Thank you. Another comment. Back here.
Oh,
Fez. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go right here, and then we'll come back to Fez.
Hello. I just wanted to talk about the use of social media. We spoke about social media, and we speak a lot about downstream, but just upstream racism. And from me being on social media, I see a lot of the shootings really just bringing out people really voicing their opinions in ways they wouldn't do it in person. So how would you say that the media and social media is doing more harm or doing more good in what we're trying to do as far as policy change?
I actually think, I've said this for a long time, and it's going to make me sound as old as Judge Harris, but I don't do Facebook, Twitter, or any of those things for the simple reason that I think the worst thing that you can do, especially in a country like the United States of America, is to allow people to voice their opinions anonymously. You know, part of the civil rights struggle was, a lot of it was good people wanting the world to be a better place, and some of it was shaming people into avoiding articulating certain thoughts or displaying certain kinds of behavior because it just was so frowned upon. I put a lot of stock into shaming people into not being who they really want to be. I do think you have to drag people to their better angels all the time. And as soon as you have a mechanism for people to vent their spleen, all the baggage of their lives, all the things that they are angry at that have nothing to do with this poor boy who's been shot, and allowing them to sit there and say horrible things anonymously, you are appealing to their worst selves. And shame on newspapers who decided that, you know, the industry may be failing, so we're going to turn ourselves into a social networking site and take a comment from every idiot that's out there. It's, once you do that, you can't take it back. Once things are on Google, you cannot take them back. And words matter and words hurt. And I absolutely believe that, and here's the other thing that never used to happen. You'd have one idiot, but they find a bunch of others because now they're all commenting on the same site. Now you've got your community. There goes your community. People finding each other. And it strengthens them. And it enables a Donald Trump. There are lots of things that enable Donald Trump. I don't want to just lay it at the feet of social media. But it enables people to now proudly come to rallies that are televised and say horrible things. It enables a guy who's running for president to call an entire race of people rapists and murderers and not get an outcry that literally drives him from the country's borders. That's what should have happened. It didn't happen because we've been allowing people to indulge their worst selves for years now. And now they're used to it. And making fun of people is a national pastime. How many people, yeah, we should use the cards for this. How many people watch American Idol just for the early rounds? For all of the spectacularly untalented people who delusionally believe that they have a shot. Of course you do. People watch Jerry Springer and Maury Povich for the same reason. We really need to, I mean, this is kind of off topic, but we need to really get a hold of who we are. We are really running away with the darkest parts of our souls, and we think we're not because we're doing it anonymously. And I think that racism and the expression of racism has had a remarkable resurgence because it's been allowed to be displayed anonymously.
Brother Jeffrey.
Thank you. And Leslie's not really old.
And yet, I have seen this conversation come to the fore of our national conscience on the strength of social media.
That's true. That's true. That's a good point. It's a really good point.
That the simultaneous rallies that occurred last year, right, was organized through social media, right? You know, and I remember after coming back from Ferguson and starting, you know, getting the information, you know, through my phone and sitting, I had grabbed my daughter and I said, okay, tell me about hashtags. What does that mean again? And, you know, Twitter, what's a handle? You know, I told her to take me through all of it because I realized that a real movement was occurring and there was a platform.
Yeah, it's true.
By which people can express. And when I heard this young man say, you know, I've heard people express things that they normally haven't expressed before. What I saw in some of the stuff that I've read were testimonies of folks who would talk about their experiences of trauma, you know, with the police, and that how amazingly similar it was, and that it was a realization that there's some policy issues here. If someone in South Carolina and someone in Arizona and someone in Massachusetts can have very similar experiences and the police, you know, behaving in such similar ways. And so, you know, and I applaud, you know, those folks who continue to keep it going through social media. I just think it's an amplifier. It could be an amplifier for good things, and it can be an amplifier for bad things. And so you know, I like Twitter.
Judge Harris. Well, we'll take you and we'll come back to Roy.
One of the things, see, judges in Massachusetts, while they were on the bench, could not be on social media. So that's why I don't know a lot of these things. I was late coming to, I had to
It's
wait till I
not because
retired.
you're old.
Not because I'm old. It's because I had to wait till I retired before I could go on social media. And it has been enlightening to me to follow some of the threads, the thoughts that young people are having. And I love it because I've learned a lot. You know, I'm a part of the generation that got to hold hands and sing "We Shall Overcome." And the feeling that gave you of being part of something bigger than you, I wanted my children to experience that, to feel that they were part of a generation that's going to change America. Black Lives Matter is the closest thing that I've seen in years to that, where young people feel that they are stepping out and doing something that makes a difference as a community that's bigger than each of them individually. So I love it in that sense. I agree with you. I've seen some very hateful things on social media. How many of you have seen Eyes on the Prize? Okay. I had the fortune of being able to help work on that in the very early parts. I ran into one of folks who, like she is over there, worked at Eyes on the Prize at Blackside back in those days. They're showing that coming up. I could not watch that while I was sitting on the bench. Yeah. Because even though I worked on it, if I watched it, I couldn't go to work. Because I took such anger with me. And I cannot be angry while I'm sitting in judgment of other people. So I would not watch it over those years while I was a judge. And then having to sit in court and listen to things. It just didn't work. So I am very careful about how much I use social media. You know, for me, like my computer is a typewriter more than anything else. You know, but it's also, I found relatives that I never knew I had because of social media. So I agree there's that balancing act, and I just ignore the bad stuff, you know, and try to at least.
Roy.
You know, where would you be able to avoid bad stuff? You're going to the Stone Age without social media and, you know, certain digital apparatuses. So snail mail's not going to become the wave of the future. Cable vision is not coming back. You're going to the Stone Age. No.
Fez.
I could be way off base here, so if I am, I hope you all will correct me. I feel like exclusively focusing on, or overwhelmingly focusing on bad policing is perhaps a little bit parochial, because I feel that bad policing is reinforced by broader systematic failures. So let me flesh this out. I mean, let's not even touch what happened in the case of Laquan McDonald, where it went all the way up to the mayor's office. But things that just seem to make sense, like if you've ever seen an episode of Law and Order SUV, you know that SVU, you know that you know that prosecutors work closely with the police to get prosecutions, and yet in Tamir Rice's case, there was not a special prosecutor. I mean, this is just common sense things, that there is a profound conflict of interest there. And then same with the case of, you know, pushing for policy, asking police to have body cameras. I mean, it's in public health, we'd say that's just a downstream solution to an upstream problem, because look, Eric Garner died in front of our eyes, and what happened? The only person against whom any charges have been brought is a 21-year-old by the name of Ramsey Orta, the guy who had the courage to actually film the incident and put it online, who has been harassed nonstop and is going to go to trial, I think, in the next few years. So I was just hoping if you'd comment on that. Thank you.
What struck me in the Laquan McDonald case was the notion that Mayor Manuel would say, you know, he was going to bring in a task force. You think, you shouldn't have a task force to tell you how to run a police department. You shouldn't be mayor if you don't know that you don't need a task force to tell you how to run a police department. And that's just true. And to me, a task force is a stalling tactic. The problem is that what he's afraid of, I believe, is the level of entrenchment there. So, because it's not just Laquan McDonald. It is a system that has turned a blind eye to things as extreme as Laquan McDonald and lesser things over such a great period of years, and a system of interdependency politically and socially that where we kind of shore each other up and we kind of don't really call each other out. And that exists in many, 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 many places. Maybe not ironically, Massachusetts and Boston in particular tends to be more progressive than most other places. I will never forget getting a call in 2010 from a South Carolina police chief that said to me, hey, we're kind of thinking about starting up some community policing down here. It was 2010, Massachusetts, we've been doing it in Boston since the 1990s. So, even with all the progressive stuff that, relatively speaking, that we do here, we still have issues here. And that speaks to the depth of the foundation of this and how difficult it is for anybody who lives in 4-year increments, because anyone who's elected district attorney lives in 4-year increments. State legislators live in 2-year increments. I was a sheriff, I had a 6-year term. You can get a lot more done in 6 years with nobody bothering you than you can, if you're looking around the corner every 3 years. And that's part of the problem. So you tend to listen to the people who support your candidacy and give you money, and to beat down the voices or beat back the voices that's why you say to people, vote. And make sure you vote, because that gets people's attention.
Brother Jeffrey.
I know it seems that body cameras for the police seems like I think you said downstream solution to an upstream problem. But what that does is that it shines a light on the problem that had not been shined before. You think about the Laquan McDonald case. There was a police report written about what happened. When you saw the video and you saw the disparity between that and the police report, same thing with the gentleman who was Walter Scott, shot down in South Carolina. That officer filed a police report. And then when you saw the video, you saw the very different reality that went on. In the civil rights movement, what really gripped the nation was the fact that it was televised, that people could see folks getting beat and the hoses being put on people and then getting beat at lunch counters and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm an advocate for as much light as you could shine upon things, we need to get it done. They've done a pilot on police body cams in Las Vegas. It's one of the communities that I've worked in. And there has been a reduction, significant reduction in, police complaints or community complaint grievances or whatever the thing is, around the police, because the police officers know that, their actions are being filmed and can be seen by a wider audience. So although it seems like a small piece, I think it sort of hooks into the revolution that is social media, that, people can see what's happening, can talk about the disparities, can find similarities, and then hopefully collectively find solutions.
Brother Roy.
I think we need to keep in mind when we have this conversation that the conversation is going to land differently for different groups of people. So if you're on a perimeter and you're watching racism, the conversation for you is a lot different than if racism is standing on your neck. And so, there's certain people that would, I think, say if you're the one and it's standing on your neck, you probably want to just take some notes and watch the example of folks who have thrived and survived in spite of. Because that's what we're going to have to deal with, the in spite of. Like, I understand what folks are saying, but I'm past that age where I'm like, in spite of, how you're going to get it done. And then one common thing you're going to see in particular communities is they minimize their involvement with the agencies they have the problems with, and they begin to do things on their own, So, that's why I keep emphasizing, build your own community. Like, I come from a community I would say is ruined, okay? And so I'm like, I think we have to build back from scratch, I think we need to start from scratch. I think we need to do a head count. We need to find out who's who, because some people are with it. Some people are not, you know? So some people want to do something different. That's slang we use, you know, I'm with the, you know what I mean? And so as a result, I'm like, all right, cool, so we're doing different things. So you have to go on and build your community or join a community that at least has a clue. Like some of us, and I don't want to sit up
I'm
here.
going to ask you to
Go ahead. You want me to what?
Wrap
it up?
Yeah.
Wrap it up? I would just suggest that there's some of us that, I think is very clear to us, and there's some of us that's like we're still debating the issue. The debate is over for me. There's nothing to debate. Listen, it's action and nothing else. I don't need to hear another stat. I don't need to see another graph. Nothing. I don't need anybody to try to convince me, like, try to make friends again. I'm like, all right, let's try and figure out how to survive in spite of.
Judge.
In the early 90s, Newman Flanagan was the district attorney. He stepped down. I read in the Herald, so it must be true, that I was being considered as one of the people to replace Newman Flanagan. I knew that I would never run for office because I'm not a politician. And don't be looking at me like that. I would not get elected because I can't do the glad handing and stuff that you need to do to get elected. So I never thought about it. But then Ralph Martin was appointed. And we both had the pleasure of working for Ralph Martin, as did Rashawn and others. And whenever I put down on my resume that I was an assistant district attorney, I emphasized it was under Ralph Martin because I found a different approach with him. And I believe he had the courage. His father was a police officer. But I believe he had the courage to stand up, to the police at times. There's a young lady who was one of my distant mentees, Miss James, Marilyn James, I don't know her married name. She's down in Baltimore. She's the prosecutor there. Thank you, Mosby. She stood up. Now, it might cost her her job when it comes to re-election. But you can't do this type of work and worry about being re-elected. When I go out, I never take more than one drink because I will not have a police officer be able to brag that he got Judge Harris, And there are some who would love to be able to say that. And so I am very careful because you cannot come into my courtroom and say things that I know are not true and think I'm going to let it go because you're a police officer. So I have some police officers who like me and some who don't. It's part of the job. And if you're afraid to stand up to the police, you should not take that job. If your life is dependent on being re-election and the police are the only thing standing in front of you, don't do it if you can't stand up to them. I know we got it.
We've had a very full day. A day talking about problems and beginning to talk about what are some of the solutions, or at least talking about some of the barriers to getting to some of those solutions. And now there's a very important piece that we need to do as we think about move forward. And the last thing I'd like for you to do then is to take one of your cards, either one, and write on that card an action that you think that you should do, or an action that you think that others should do in addressing this issue. And you're going to drop those cards in the box. And as we begin to think about how our next steps around this particular issue, we want to look at those entries that you've given. That's the thing that you do as we begin to think about what's the next thing that we should do. Today has been a wonderful day. Please give our panel a thank you. Today has been a wonderful day, and there's no way that an activity happens without the help of some very wonderful people. And I'm going to make the mistake that I'm going to make something that I should not do, but I'm going to try to call a couple of names. Meg Keating Kara Peterson's staff with the communications group, Ann Fiddler, Joanna Brown, and I'm certain that I have left off someone who is critically important to this day, but I'm so grateful to them, and if you'll give them applause as well. And then finally, what I want to do is to thank Dean Galea. When Dean Galea suggested that we needed to talk about tough issues, he said, talk about the tough issues in any way that you think is going to make it real, in a way that's going to put the issues in front of people so that we as a community can really begin to think about these things. So I'm grateful for his leadership. I'm grateful for his encouragement and for support. And so I'm also grateful to each of you for being here. And please give both Dean Galea and yourselves an applause.